Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Death Stare, submitted by YNT Guy. I was a county sheriff in Arkansas when this happened. I've since moved on to Louisiana, but at the time I was working in Craighead County. I had about 6 years on the job and was still a young buck, as the saying goes. At that time, we were still on one-man patrols covering a pretty large area of the state. Not that Craighead County is that huge, but you get the picture. I'm not giving dates and times about this, and I prefer just using my username I've submitted. It was a summer evening when this happened, and I had just finished up speaking with a landowner who was having some issues with recent thefts on his property. I was out in the middle of nowhere between Black Oak and Manila. Driving down a county road, I saw a car that had gone off the road and was just sitting there. It had run head-on into a group of trees, and I could tell right away that things were not going to be good. No one was out of the vehicle looking at it or standing in the road looking for help. The car was still running as I pulled up to it, but there was tons of smoke pouring out from the hood and no movement inside the vehicle. I radioed in and got out to check on the driver and any other passengers, and all I saw was the driver slumped over the wheel. His window was down, and he was sitting there moaning with blood all over himself and the dashboard and the seat. It looked like he hit a tree at a pretty good clip. I immediately radioed the situation again and asked for an ambulance and backup. Knowing full well it was going to take time to get out to this godforsaken area I was in, I just began to ask the man questions to see how coherent he was. But he just kept saying or moaning rather loudly, "Belly, belly." I leaned in a little bit and saw how bad the damage actually was. He had been holding some kind of glass container. Later I found out it was not what I originally thought it was, which I thought was a bottle of booze. It was some kind of heavy vase. Don't ask me why he was holding it, but I kind of pieced together afterwards he must have been looking at it in his hands when he went off the road. When he hit the tree, he fell backwards then forwards into the steering wheel, and part of the vase base hit the wheel and jammed into his stomach. I asked him to slowly lean back, still talking to him to make sure he was awake while radioing in that I really needed help, that I had a very injured driver on my hands. He slowly moved back as far as he could in his seat, but the car had crumpled so much that he didn't have a lot of room to move. The seat was jammed up against the steering wheel pretty good, also a sign that he'd been traveling at a very high rate of speed. I kept him talking as best I could, but most of it was just moans and blood was coming out of his mouth, so I told him to stop talking once I saw that. But I told him that help was on its way and he needed to stay with me. He simply nodded slowly, and I looked down into his lap and saw the vase protruding out from his midsection. It was basically sticking out of him with blood pouring into his lap, and I again radioed what I noticed and said again, "I need help now," and was told by dispatch that help was on its way. That's when I heard the sound of a vehicle coming from behind me. I instinctively looked up and down the road, but didn't see any vehicles coming in either direction. I did leave my lights on for anybody who might pass by. But then I turned and looked across the road, and I saw a beat-up old station wagon driving across the open ground of what once was a field for some sort of crop, but nothing had been planted that year, which was obvious with the dust and dirt kicking up behind this vehicle that was heading towards me. For a second I forgot to pay attention to the injured driver and was staring at this car as it came closer, and then that driver found a culvert to drive over to get onto the road. This beat-up old car pulled up slowly, and a very strange-looking man got out of the vehicle. I did notice there were no plates on the car, and defensively told the driver to stay where he was. I looked down at the injured driver and said, "Stay with me," one more time, then turned to the man who was not listening to my commands, and had gotten out of his vehicle and was walking towards me. At that point, I needed all the help I could get, and after realizing that the man who was walking towards me was not inebriated or anything like that, I said, "Hey man, I need your help." I needed to get to my vehicle for my first aid kit to see what I could do to help this other driver. But now this man was standing about 4 feet from me, and again, he looked so strange. He had a shock of white hair and was wearing a very dirty wife-beater tucked into green army fatigues. I told him, "Man, there's been an accident," which was stating the obvious. "I need you to sit and talk to this driver, but don't touch anything. Do not assist in any other way other than talking." He stood blankly looking at me, and I asked, "Do you understand that?" He never said a word. He just nodded. I ran back to my car and grabbed for my first aid kit, again radioing in what was happening, and that a citizen was now on the scene assisting in a small way. When I walked back to the car with the injured driver, I looked down and saw he was in even worse shape. Blood was now flowing out of his mouth more freely, and he couldn't speak, as any time he tried, he would cough and more blood would come out. I asked the other man to step back, as I was now in a state of, what the hell am I supposed to do here? And inside I was yelling for help to please get out here faster. I was losing this guy, and I knew that I couldn't really remove him from the vehicle without doing more damage from this vase thing that was still sticking in his gut. I kept going back and forth. Do I move him? Do I let him stay? Do I move him? Do I let him stay? But I just kept talking to him, trying to calm down, while the other man who just showed up was now just staring over my shoulder. I yelled into my radio that you need to hurry. I'm losing this guy. Which I was. He was bleeding profusely now, and I knew that if help did not arrive within a couple of minutes, he was a goner. I had to think what I could do to help give this guy more time, and I thought maybe if I can get him out of the car, knowing that it might kill him, perhaps it would take pressure off of this object sticking out of him. Throwing caution to the wind, I asked the man behind me to help me get this guy out of the vehicle, and I started to open the door. Thankfully it did. I really needed this guy's help. But the man didn't move. He just continued to stare into the car. I yelled at him, "I need your help right now." I got the car door open and started to assess the situation more, and decided that what I needed to do was get the man out of the car. But again, the man who just showed up did nothing. I wasn't thinking about any trouble that I would get in by helping the guy in the car, but I knew I had to do something. Somehow I was able to get the seat back a little bit and give the guy some relief, which he gave an audible sigh of, but it was full of blood. I could tell that there was some pressure relief right away, though. My hands were now covered in blood, and I was slowly moving this gentleman out of the vehicle against what I'm sure was every instinct in my body to not move him. I slowly got him out of the car, yelling at the other man that I really needed his help, but he just stood there doing nothing. I finally got the man out of his car and laid him down on the side of the road on his back, and then propped up his head with one of my boots. He then sighed again, which gave me reason to believe I had done the right thing. He was breathing a little easier. The man who had pulled up still just stood there, and I looked at him and said, "Why aren't you helping me, man? This guy's dying." He only looked back at me with this crazy stare in his eye and said, "Well, that's the reason I came over here, to see him die." He then just stood there again, not saying a word. I again radioed in the situation update and faintly heard sirens in the distance. I looked up at the other guy, but now he was just walking back to his beat-up old station wagon. Without a word, he got in, started the engine, and slowly drove by me, looking out the window the entire time. He stopped for a second and said, "Guess I'm not going to see anyone die today." And then he drove off into the field where he had come from. Thankfully, the sirens I heard were my salvation. An ambulance and another sheriff were racing towards me and quickly took over and did their thing. Thankfully, the driver of the vehicle didn't die, but he came unbelievably close. I was told later that his loss of blood was so massive that had they not gotten on scene in just a minute more, he probably would have died. When asked what I had done, I was waiting to be reprimanded by them for moving him out of the car, but one of the paramedics said, "No, you did the right thing. He needed that pressure relief." They rushed him to a hospital, and like I said, he did survive. When he was more coherent, he did in fact go off the road while looking at this vase he had purchased for his wife. He got it from an antique dealer somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, Not really an antique dealer, just an older gentleman who sold antiques. But anyway, back on the scene, I was talking to my fellow sheriff and telling him all about the other guy who showed up. He looked around and didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I told him he had driven through the field in a beat-up old station wagon, gave a full description of what he looked like, and said despite my prompting, he didn't try to help at all, and said he was just there to watch a human being die. I only had the description of the car and no license plate, and had no idea where he drove off to. My partner said he never noticed anything as he and the ambulance were flying up to help me, but that he also wasn't looking for anything like that. As more people arrived to take care of the scene, I wandered around looking for traces of the vehicle that I had seen. I did find tire tracks over the culvert back into the field, but there were other tire tracks there as well. I have no idea who that guy was, how he happened to be out there at that time, and why he didn't help. But to this day I am still chilled about those words he said. I guess I'm not going to see anyone die today. As I mentioned, I've moved on to a parish in Louisiana and have been on that job for the last 18 years. I've seen a lot of crazy stuff and been in a lot of crazy situations. But nothing has affected me as much as that strange man whose only mission that day was to see someone die. When we checked the area for vehicles of that description, no one had any information for us. For all intent and purposes, he only lives in my memory now, with the words he said. I guess I'm not going to see anyone die today. As much as that affected me and still does, I'm at least happy to say that no one did die. I've often played that over and over in my head. Maybe he was a figment of my imagination, but I don't think so. I know he was there, and I'll never forget his strange stare and his words. Crazy Domestic, submitted by Rick V. Law enforcement is a family affair for me. My father was an officer in the town I grew up in, as was my uncle. Growing up with that atmosphere around me, I decided at a pretty early age that I also wanted to be a cop when I grew up. Some would say it's nepotism, and I suppose there was some of that when I applied for a job after graduating with an associate's degree in criminal justice. I was hired, went through the academy, and became a police officer in my hometown when I was 21 years old. My town is in the suburbs of a larger city, and kind of on the border, a first-ring suburb if that makes sense. So we had areas of town that were very well-to-do, and other areas not so much. We never had any huge scandals or anything crazy the first 2 years I was on the job. Just lots of DWI cases and lots of domestic violence cases, and of course there was all the other routine stuff. Chasing underage drinking parties and that sort of thing. Yeah, I was that guy, ruining the fun of all the younger kids. But I did pride myself on having a good relationship with young people in the town. And more often than not, we just took their beer or whatever and made them dump it out and get out of their party spots. What helped me was being close to their age. It was pretty easy for me to know where they were if they were partying, and it always amazed me that despite being busted over and over again by myself and other fellow officers, the kids always went to the same places. I guess I did the same stupid stuff when I was their age too. And again, most of the time we didn't report them to their parents, we just told them to knock it off and to not come back. But I digress. In my third year, I got called to a domestic violence incident. 3 other officers also showed up with a couple that was very drunk and very belligerent and very so fighting. I mean cats and dogs stuff. The woman had smashed a beer bottle on the husband's head, and he had gotten in plenty of shots on her too. By the time we got there, the guy was sitting out on his porch bleeding profusely, his wife inside also tending to her wounds. As I said, both of them were drunk and hadn't called us, but the neighbors had. Apparently they had had enough of the yelling, screaming, and violence for that night. I was the second to arrive and got the lowdown of what was going on from my fellow officer who was first on the scene. He was talking to the husband, so I went inside to talk to the wife. Both were hammered beyond belief, and their stories were of course conflicting of how it started, who did what, and the normal stuff you always see on the cop shows on TV. It gets old pretty quick for an officer having to sort this stuff out, but it happens so often it becomes routine. Both of them needed medical treatment and both were going to be charged. So as more officers showed up along with the EMTs, we had to suss out what was going to happen to the two children still inside playing their Nintendo, as if nothing really happened. When I asked them what had happened that night, I got the feeling that they saw this kind of thing all the time. They were both in their mid-teens, and nothing happened to them. They were just a witness to these frequent fights from their parents. After quick checks of their background, it became apparent that this happened a lot. I was actually amazed that I had never been called out here prior to this incident. As the guy was being tended to by EMTs outside, another pair went inside to work on the wife. When she looked out the door and saw her husband, she went into another rage and was very hard to deal with. I stood next to her, telling her to calm down so the EMTs could look at her and figure out if there were any other family that could take the kids before we called CPS. I very much support CPS, but in cases like this, I try everything in my power to get other family members involved before calling them. She mentioned her parents lived in the town next to us, and we started the process of contacting them to come and get the kids. I was told by another officer that that was what was going to happen, so I felt better about the situation right there. That's when one of the teenagers started crying. I asked him if he was okay. I knew that he was going through a rough time with all this, but I sensed that something else was going on here. He kept saying that he hated living there and wanted out. He was 16 and mentioned to me that he wanted to leave, but he couldn't legally, but he was tired of it. When I asked him what he was tired of, he got quiet for a minute and said of what my parents do. With another officer present, I questioned him about what his parents did. We asked if there was any drug dealing going on or anything like that, but he said he wasn't supposed to talk about it. He kind of looked down to the floor. I told him it was okay and he wasn't going to be in any trouble at all if he told us what was happening, which he laughed through his crying and said, "Oh yeah, I highly doubt that." He then held up his arm, and there were cigarette burns on his forearm. A lot of them. I hadn't noticed that before, and asked how that had happened. He said he got burned if he ever questioned his parents about anything they were doing. We continued to question him and his brother, and it finally came out. They told us to check the basement. That's all they would say for fear of any reprisal from their parents. There were now about 8 officers there, and the grandparents showed up. The kids were taken off to the side, and other officers were tending to the husband and wife, and my friend, I'll just call Joe, and I checked out the rest of the house. Outside of the blood spatters and broken lamps and a TV, the typical domestic violence scene, we told our lieutenant who had showed up what the kids had said, and we were going to go check the basement. We got out our flashlights as we approached the basement door through the kitchen, and then realized that the lights for the basement didn't work. I went down first, playing my light on the stairs and the basement floor, and heard some muffled crying. When we got down to the floor, there was a jumble of all kinds of crap piled on the walls and strewn throughout the basement. But we kept hearing this crying coming from a far corner and moved right over to it. There were 2 large boxes, or what we thought were boxes, covered with blankets, and when I pulled the first blanket back, I got the shock of my life as a fairly new police officer. There were 2 large dog cages next to each other, each with a child inside. The doors were locked with heavy chains and padlocks, and I'll always be haunted by the faces of those 2 little kids, a boy and a girl, their faces streaked with dirt, and they were wearing next to nothing. Each had a dog bowl of water in their cages that were knocked over and empty. When they saw us, they recoiled from the light and burst into tears and started crying even louder. I immediately called for someone to bring bolt cutters down into the basement and said our lieutenant needed to get down there immediately. We started to try to calm the kids down and told them that they were safe and that we were going to help them. Obviously, a call to CPS was now imminent. We quickly moved to get the cages open and the small kids, ages 6 and 7, out. It was obvious they were malnourished and looked like they were beaten often. More EMTs came down and took over getting the kids out into safety. A messed up situation just went from a messed up situation to a very terrifying situation. When the kids came up into the light of the upstairs, They were blinking, and it was clear they had been down in that basement for some time. Not all of what I'm going to tell you right now happened on the scene, but we came to find out that these two kids were not the progeny of the husband and wife. They were foster kids. After questioning the husband and wife, they immediately clammed up, and we began talking to the two older siblings again. They broke down and told us that their parents had taken these two little kids on as a source of income. Most of the time they were locked in the basement, and if they tried to get out, they were locked in the cages. The only time they ever came out were when social workers paid a visit and were allowed to get cleaned up to make it look like everything was fine. My heart broke upon seeing those kids locked in the cages, but my heartbreak turned to rage when I heard the story. Of course, over time, there was much more legwork to be done in this case, and a lot of testimony from myself and all the other officers on board. But, over time, we found out that the kids had been living there for 2 years, came from 2 separate families whose parents were locked up in jail, and the only thing that failed them was the system. All of the kids had been threatened to lie about what was going on for fear of reprisal from the parents, and we found out that the 2 older siblings had had guns put to their head. They were threatened with knives and all sorts of other things if they told anything about what the parents were doing. When all the kids had gotten to the safety of where they had to go, the older siblings with the grandparents who claimed they had no idea what was going on, and the other kids going to the safety of foster care, I started to question whether or not I wanted to be a police officer. But after speaking with my superiors, my close friend Joe, and counselors, they all continued to point out that what we had uncovered and did was exactly what police officers are supposed to do: protect and serve everyone. I was just afraid of the prospect of having to deal with more situations like this, and wishing kids were never involved. It really did break my heart. Both the parents were charged with a slew of things, including child endangerment, and got hefty jail sentences. As I mentioned, the 2 older siblings were released to the custody of the grandparents, and as this happened 5 years ago, I learned that both graduated from high school and went on to college. The parents are still in jail. I have no idea what that relationship with the parents is like, if there's anything there. As for the 2 kids we found in the basement, when I asked later on, I was only told that they were safely with Child Protective Services, and the right decisions were made to find them a new home nowhere near my hometown. The news of this rocked our little town, and now that I look back on everything, I'm proud to say I played a role in saving the lives of 4 kids. God knows what might have happened had those 2 drunken idiots not gotten into a knockdown drag-out that night. The kids looked like they were on the verge of starvation. I mean, you could see their bones through their skin. How no one who visited didn't know they were in trouble or got through checks from social services is a mystery to me. I'm sure there was a lot of splaining done when the investigation went on. So this did happen some years ago, and I'm still an officer. I'm proud of what I do, and I'm very aware of what the political climate is like out there for cops. I have always maintained a great relationship with all the citizens of my town, and every day I'm proud to put on the uniform and do my best. I'm also very well aware that that's not the case for many officers across the country, but I can only do what I do, and believe that I do it well. Now when I go into domestic cases, especially those that involve children, I am unbelievably thorough with how I handle myself and the situations I find myself in. I hope to God I never find kids in that kind of situation again, but I know in this messed up world it's bound to happen some way or another. Every day I do put on that uniform, I make an oath to myself that when facing any issue with my fellow townspeople, I will always do the right thing in every circumstance. I know this story doesn't sound super scary to everybody, but it is when you see it and deal with it. It's just as scary as pulling over a drunk driver knowing the damage they could have caused, or in many cases do cause. I've seen lots of things. I've seen bodies nearly severed in half after a car crash. I've seen suicide scenes. And I've been involved in a lot of investigations that most people couldn't handle. It doesn't make me a Superman. It makes me a good cop. I can't unsee the things that I saw on that day as a 3-year veteran of the police force in my town. And it's a reminder to me every day that while sometimes things are sunny and great, others are living under a dark cloud of terror and fear. My only wish is that less of this would happen in this messed up society we live in. Be safe out there. And I implore everyone, if you see something, say something. You might just make scary and terrible situations better for those involved. The Office Phantom, submitted by Officer Keith. Love your channel, especially love your first responder stories. I thought I would keep that vein going with my story that I've never really talked to many people about. I don't want anyone to think I'm crazy, and I have 2 more years to go before I retire, and I'd like to keep it that way. I am in my 28th year as a law enforcement officer. I've seen it all, heard it all, been there, done that. But one thing always sticks out in my head, and probably always will, because I have no explanation for what happened. At the time, we still had partners in our vehicles, which over time dwindled to one-on-one for cost-saving measures or whatever bureaucrats decide is the right thing for us to do. Frankly, I wish I was still rolling with a partner, but the powers that be and the thinking from up top say otherwise. So be it. We're all in our cars by ourselves. One night on routine patrol, though, my partner and I got a call of a break-in at an office building at a warehouse on the edge of town. This place was sort of a recycling factory for scrap metal, and I will be completely forthright in saying the property did butt up next to a cemetery. Maybe that explains things. The call came in around 10:30 on a Thursday night. It was early fall, and we immediately thought about kids doing something in the cemetery for a Halloween scare, and maybe their antics rolled over onto the property of the office space. We got out there and found the owner of the building in a semi-hysterical state. He said he was working late and thought the entire place was locked up, but he kept hearing noises in parts of the office that sounded like people moving around. He was a licensed concealed carry guy, but he didn't have any firearms on him at the time. He had done a routine check of all the spaces. He didn't find anybody, but every time he went back to his desk to do some paperwork, he heard doors opening, faint laughter, and objects moving about. We told him it was no problem to be there, and we would look around to see if we could scare out some kids or some other trespasser who might be there for more than holiday scares. His office was at the front of the building, and there was a long hallway with offices and other spaces all the way to the back on each side. We told him to wait there, we would check on things, and then come back and talk to him when we were done. We proceeded to walk down the hall after asking him if the office doors were open, and he said yes, they were. Only the outside doors were locked, and there were no windows on the outside of the building. The only ways in were the front door and the emergency door to the rear. My partner and I walked down the hall and opened each door and checked inside each room. Some had desks and chairs, others were just storage areas, which we thoroughly looked through, including all the closets, the bathroom area. We checked everywhere. I noticed that it was a drop ceiling, and my partner jumped up onto a desk and with his baton pushed open a ceiling tile to look around to see if anybody was up there fooling around. There was nothing. He got down and we looked at each other and shrugged. And that's when we heard the laughter. It was a lot louder than what the guy had originally said he heard. Maybe it's because we were in the back area when he had only heard it from his office. That was just my immediate thought. We quickly moved out into the hallway, looking up and down, trying to discern where the laughter was coming from. And when I say laughter, this wasn't the pleasant laughter you hear people make when they're at a comedy show or watching their favorite sitcom. This was a creepy, high-pitched laugh. And when I thought about it, it sounded like that funny-looking kid in the movie Fright Night. He had that strange laughter, and that's what this sounded like. My partner whispered to me, "Kids," and I nodded in agreement. But we were both unnerved by the sound of that laughter. As we stood in the hallway, we heard a large bang from one of the rooms we had just checked. It was one of the storage areas that just had an old desk in it. I mean, one of those old big metal desks. But there was nothing else in the room. We moved over to that door quickly, and I opened it and flicked on the lights. There was dead silence. Then all of a sudden, the big, heavy desk, which was up against one wall, shot across the room and crashed into the far wall. We stood there watching it happen. When it crashed into the wall, we heard that crazy laughter again, now louder than ever. I calmly stepped backwards, bumped into my partner, and then shut the door. I looked at him and said, "Is this some kind of prank?" He told me to stay there, which I certainly didn't want to, but it is what I did. I was now getting pretty freaked out. He went back to get the property owner, and he brought him back to this room we were standing outside of, and asked if there were any hijinks going on that we needed to know about. He shook his head and said he was the only one there and nothing like this had ever happened before. We told him we thought something funny was going on, but we didn't tell him exactly what we had seen and heard. I opened the door again and went right over to the desk to see if there was any kind of rope or something that could have pulled the desk across the room. My partner and the property owner stood in the doorway watching what I was doing. After a minute, I was satisfied there was no human manipulation going on because there wasn't anything attached to the desk. I turned and walked back towards the door. The sound of the desk sliding back across the room to the other wall behind me made me stop and look wide-eyed at the two other men in the room. Then came the laughter. I'm not proud of this, but I literally jumped and ran towards the door, bowling into both guys. I mean, here we are supposed to be these stalwarts of justice, police officers not afraid of anything, and I'm acting like a kid in a horror movie scene. We were back out into the hallway, and I closed the door. We heard the laughter again and the sound of the desk shooting across the room back into the far wall where it crashed again. I didn't know what to do. My partner looked at me with the same face of, what the hell are we supposed to do here? Then we looked at the property owner, and all three of us had that face. What the hell was going on? We slowly regained our composure, and I went back into the room and yelled out if anyone was pulling a prank, they better get their ass out where I could see them immediately. There was nothing but silence. Then we heard a crash from the room next to it. My partner ran over to it, whipped open the door, and I heard him say, "Holy Mary Jesus, that's not possible." I ran past the property owner, got to my partner's side as he was staring and looking up at the ceiling. Remember, this is a drop ceiling. There was an office chair upside down hanging by itself like it was superglued to the ceiling. We watched it as it slowly rocked back and forth a couple of feet towards the wall where the desk had crashed. I put my hand on my partner's shoulder and pulled him backwards towards me, and when he was in the hallway, I closed the door. I said, "I think we all need to go back to the main office." All three of us walked back to the property owner's office and sat there for a minute. I then called my captain on his cell phone. I wasn't going to broadcast this over the airwaves. I told him what was going on and that he needed to get out here to see this. Of course, he thought I was pulling his leg, but I told him no. There's something very strange going on here. We need another set of eyes. He reluctantly said he would be out, and he showed up about 10 minutes later after we were just hanging out in the office. Of course, home base had been contacting us, and we just said that we were still monitoring the situation and would keep them abreast of what was going on. When my captain got there, he was already shaking his head looking at us, and we told him again what was happening. He said a lot about wasting his time, and that if there was no one in the building, we just needed to wrap this up. He said if it is a ghost, we have no jurisdiction over ghosts, and this was not our problem. We walked back down the hall to the first room where the desk was, and of course nothing happened. The captain looked at both of us with a very pissed-off look on his face, and I had to reassure him that what we had seen. And the property owner jumped in and said, "No, this has been going on all evening." My captain went over to the desk and did the same inspection I did. Then we told him about the chair again, and we went to that room, but the chair was now on all four legs in the middle of the room. There was a very long, tense moment where the captain didn't say anything. I could feel he was getting ready to read us the riot act and tell us to just get back into our car when the chair started to rock in place and then shot across the room right at us. It didn't come through the door, but went right past my captain and smashed into the wall next to him. The crazy laughter came again, and he reacted the way I did. He jumped and popped back into the hallway, almost knocking us over. He shut the door, and the crazy laughter came again. He motioned to us all that we should walk back down the hall to the main office, and we all went in. After a pregnant pause, my captain looked at the property owner and said, "I advise you to go home for the night. there's not much we can do here. We deal in criminals, not in exorcisms." He then motioned to my partner and I to come outside with him, and we followed. He said to mark this up as late-night jitters and that nothing was wrong with the building. The property owner was safe and was advised to go home for the evening. The property owner came out, turned off the lights, locked the door, and looked at us and said he was going home. My captain said, "Yeah, that's the best solution to this scenario." The guy got into his car and took off, and the captain told us to keep this to ourselves and not to mention it to anyone. So I kept my mouth shut, and so did my partner. Outside of him and my captain, I've never told anyone this story. It's funny. Now that years have passed, I think about what happened that night, and I kind of laugh. I have no idea if spirits or whatever got bored of being in the cemetery next door and came over for some scares. But we never got a call from that property again, and never heard one way or another if the desk and chair kept sliding around and if there was any more crazy laughter. Since this happened, the business has changed, but it's still there. We've heard nothing else. As I mentioned, I've seen a lot of crazy stuff in my line of work, in the many years I've been an officer, but nothing like that night. I've just chalked it up to being part of the unexplained, and something I will never get an answer for. Thanks for sharing my story. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast and channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't done so already, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Make sure you hit the notification button for every time I upload. And of course, follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to take your support a step further, find me on Patreon. A link to that is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.